All right, welcome back to episode 4, the final installment, specifically to do with this series, Black in Maine, where we have been talking about the life and times of a notorious Maine outlaw named Lauren Roberts, who was giving us a taste of what it was like to be Black in Maine in the 1920s and 1930s. Hi, my name is Jen, and this is Outcasts and Dissidents, New England's History of Misbehavior, where we talk about true crime, real renegades, and rebellious countercultures of New England's past. So, just to do a recap of what we've covered in the previous 3 episodes of this series, Black in Maine, we'll talk about, or we have talked about, the Roberts family and when they first show up on our radar in Machias, Maine, back around the time of the American Revolution. And we trace that family forward up to around 1900 when Lauren Roberts was born, 1902 specifically. And then we start picking up his story. His story was really interesting because he experienced a period of tragedy in the 1920s, or in 1920 specifically. And then in 1923, you start seeing these arrests for kind of what you would maybe expect, like stereotypically around that time, just so textbook, Black men were accused of being sexual predators. He was accused of being a sexual predator. Was he? Maybe. Was he not? Maybe. We don't know. And then it turns out, as I start digging into doing this investigation, this research on his story, I find that both the county and the state have no idea where these records went. They're like, oh, they just got rid of them. Like, really? Why? How? It was such a high profile case, right? So as we start exploring, we find all of these newspaper articles saying that he was the most wanted person in the state and that this was the biggest manhunt in Hancock County history. And all of these things that indicate that this was a really serious event. There were people buying guns who had never owned guns before because they were afraid of him, and the media really helped to reinforce that fear. Even though all of these instances of really exaggerated, violent, aggressive crimes, he usually ends up not being charged for them. So he was accused of a murder, and he was never formally charged with that murder. He was accused of this horrible rape in Augusta, and yet he never got charged on that either. He did steal things. He committed what I refer to as these crimes of desperation. So he's literally being hunted by people who are out to shoot him and probably out to kill him. So yeah, he stole cars to get away from them. He stole food because he had to live in the woods to survive, otherwise people would shoot him. I mean, it's kind of interesting because he very well may have done these horrible things. I don't know. And we may never know because the historical record only is what survives, and there's not much that survives other than newspaper records from this case. So if you caught the last episode, you know that he negotiated terms to turn himself in October of 1932. He was absolutely terrified. There were dozens of people, armed civilian posse, law enforcement that were out, even people with dogs, out to hunt him, out hunting him in the woods. And so he's out for several weeks. He finds an ally, and this ally helps him to negotiate with the sheriff to turn himself in, with the understanding that no guns would be brought to the scene. The only officer that was going to show up was the sheriff. He was going to come with Lauren's wife, and Lauren wasn't going to be charged with any of this other stuff. He was going to be treated kindly. And so he really had serious concerns for his health, for his safety, and for his treatment, which entirely stands to reason given what we know about the time, right? So he goes back to jail, and then he ends up going to prison for like a couple of years. It wasn't very long. And then when he gets out, it says there are newspaper articles that say he had been a model inmate and he had been on his best behavior while he was there, and that he felt like if people would leave him alone and give him the chance, he could turn his life around. It specifically says that he said this. So it's like he called truce with the community, and he was just like, I don't really want to be a tyrant, because they were like his reign of terror and all this stuff in the newspapers. It's like he didn't really want that. So when he comes back, it's a couple of years before you see him doing anything, and what he did was like night hunting or driving without a license. He got a speeding ticket. There was a couple of instances that were a little more reminiscent of the things that he used to do. There was an instance where him and Howard Brooks broke into a slaughterhouse and stole like 40 pounds of meat or something. And then there was an incident where he did get an OUI, which was interesting, and we'll touch on this more in a minute, but he did get an OUI. It was like in 1950 or something. It was quite a bit later on. And he ended up getting an aggravated assault charge later on as well. Him and Posses ended up getting divorced in the late 60s. But interestingly, before that, in 1950, the census says that they were already divorced. I don't see him in any census in 1960, 1970, or 1980. But what I do know is that he did end up moving to Long Island, New York. Now, what's really fascinating about this is that the place that he chose to move to was Levittown. And Levittown was this first mass-produced cookie-cutter suburb for baby boomers after World War II. He had a couple of sons that were in the military, and some of them did move down to this area. So it was kind of like the family migrated. And again, like following suit with what had happened decades before that for a lot of Black families, was that they moved to these cities where there were more Black people so that they didn't stick out so badly in these small white communities. Now, why you would move to Levittown as a Black person is just amazing, because they had been sued and gone to court because they had restrictive covenants. And even today, their Black population is not much better than Maine's. So it's totally fascinating to me that he chose this place. It's not like he moved to the Bronx or to Harlem or somewhere like that where there's more of a Black community where he could feel more included and part of it. Like, he moved to a very white place yet again. Although, to be fair, Long Island is kind of reminiscent of Maine, so maybe he just felt like he'd be more at home there. I have no idea. Nonetheless, he did get remarried, he had some more kids, and he ended up, he was in his 70s, like late 70s, he was almost 80 years old, he was 79, when he died in 1981. He was working night security when he died of a blood clot. So after this super intense, really remarkable and fascinating life, he died a totally normal death. And he even died in a position where clearly someone trusted him enough to put him in charge of night security, you know? So it's not like he was out as a thief. He had a job he was maintaining. I don't see any record of his arrests. I don't see him mentioned in newspapers in New York at all. It's really interesting. That's not to say he didn't do anything else that I just don't know about yet, or that I may never know about. But As far as I can tell from what I can see in the historical record that I so far have found access to, there's nothing. It's like he had this wild youth, and I mean, even up until, he was like 30 or something, his life was crazy. But then he really seems to have slowly chilled out. And that's all you can hope for, right? He did the best he could with the life that he had. Um, so the question came up, somebody asked me, and I mean, obviously I wanted to know, I just hadn't had, I had other focuses at that time. But the opportunity so struck that somebody asked me at the right time, what about the other few Black people in Hancock County? And so in the past, I've quoted Maine Historical Society as saying that there were only 3 Black people in Hancock County in 1930. Now, it turns out that that's not quite true. I don't think they were counting Lauren. I think they were only counting, and it's hard because, so Lauren was in jail, but at that time, I don't know if he officially technically lived in Hancock County just yet. Other than the fact that he was in the jail in Hancock County, I think he might have been boarding, but maybe they consider that he still lived in Millbridge. I'm not totally sure. So he was in the census, but he was in the jail. And then there was another guy who lived in downtown Ellsworth, just a couple streets from the jail, who was, it's so weird because in every census it says something different about where this guy's from. But at that time he was a servant for someone a couple streets over. He ended up doing some other jobs and stuff around the area. And then there was a woman from like British Guinea or somewhere down in the Caribbean, and she was married to a guy who, in this one 1930 census, they said that he was Black. But in every other census, in every other record, I find that he's actually white. So I'm not sure if this was like one of those instances, like with Lauren's kids, where Lauren was considered mulatto, then he married a white woman, and so his kids were considered white in the censuses. Really interesting. So it might be something like that with this guy, where he was just generations enough removed at that point that, he looked white enough that they passed him off as white for the most part. 1930 was just harder on, I don't know. Very weird. And then there was none other than Lauren's brother, who I had found in family trees. It said that he died in 1920, and I didn't find other references to him, but it turns out that he was actually very much alive. I think one of the earlier censuses that I found referred to him as Donald, and so I was referring to him as Donald in my searches, which is weird because you can search for somebody, like I could type in Donald and it would send me a David, and yet somehow I never ended up with his other records. I don't know. But yeah, no, he lived until like the 70s or 80s. He lived for a long time. So I was wrong. I was wrong about a couple of things. First of all, there were actually 4 Black people, at least, if not 5, in Hancock County in 1930. And mind you, I had to go through 400 or 500 pages of census to find this information. So it did take me pretty much an entire day to put all this information together. So, because then I find all these people and then I start doing research on them. So what I found was really interesting. So, we'll just say that it's the 4. We'll just say that woman's husband, he was white. We're not going to even count him. But Donis, the other guy, James, I think his name is James Murphy, I think. And then the woman, Winnie Bradstreet, and then her husband, even if we don't count him, they all were arrested multiple times for bootlegging, even after Prohibition. So really fascinating about this is that Lauren was never accused of that. Nothing comes up, like any reference that Lauren even drank, until 1950 when he was arrested when he got that OUI. I think it was 1950. But all these other people were arrested for bootlegging. So it's like the one thing that he didn't do wrong was bootlegging. I don't understand. Even Lauren's friend George Brooks ended up being arrested for alcohol possession during Prohibition. Donis ended up being part of a huge conspiracy where there was like 33 people indicted for bootlegging. They considered them a gang of bootleggers, moonshiners, and of the 33 of them who were indicted and charged and all this stuff in the conspiracy, Donis was the only one who actually did jail time. He did 2 months in Waldo County Jail. I still have a lot more research to do on this whole thing. I just found that really, truly fascinating because it is such a common thing for people to be accused of, especially where you imagine like the bulk of what happened in Lauren's story happened during Prohibition. Maine was the first place to have Prohibition. We had Prohibition right up until 1933, like everybody else. And so it's, between 1923 and 1932 that Lauren's getting in all this trouble. And that's right in the heart of Prohibition. So the fact that they never even accused him, like, almost gives credence to the fact, like, maybe these people really did bootleg and maybe they really did moonshine. But regardless, you're looking at 100% incarceration rate among the Black community at one time or another, not at the same time necessarily, but at one time or another, they were all incarcerated and they were all charged with crimes. Really interesting. I don't know what to make of it yet because this is really new information to me. I just looked this up. So I did want to share it. I did want to include that because, how do we compare and contrast his story to other people's stories? Like I said, his story is pretty extraordinary because it was so high profile and so intense. It's so impactful for him, the Black community, and the white community who were totally terrified of what was happening. I mean, how afraid can you possibly be that someone's going to steal your car? Like, obviously, I don't want someone to steal my car, but I'm not, like, going to go buy a gun to keep them from doing it, Like, I don't know. Whatever. I'm not afraid of him. I guess he had gone into somebody's house, but it was someone he knew lived in the house. Like, it's such a tough call, and it's something that's so hard to analyze from the future. And I know historians really shouldn't get too far into that, but I do think it's important to, on some level, consider the emotions. So I do that, but try not to do it too much. Try not to read too much into the situation. Just try to look at the facts of what I know. Even the facts of what I know are just, really mind-blowing in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's what I know about being Black in Maine in the 1920s and 1930s, you guys. Is they might shoot you. It's so terrible. We didn't lynch people, but I guess we shot them. So we'd shoot at them and we'd buy guns to do it. Send the dogs out. I mean, I do think there was a huge influence from white supremacy that really plays into this and doesn't get talked about in the same way. And again, it's because there were just so few people. And I guess it wasn't considered important, and people still don't consider it important, clearly, because they're not talking about it. So I'm just glad that I was able to come across this story and that I've been able to share it with everyone. I hope that you guys have enjoyed listening to this story and have learned from it. And now you know. Now we all know. Of course, this is, like I said, just one example. But we do get to hear some examples from other places, like Donis and his bootlegging conspiracy apparently was out of Waldo County. Stay tuned for more on that. Someday, one of these days, I'll look into that some more and really get into it. I'm hoping that Waldo County kept better records than Hancock County. We got to hear about Washington County and a whole lot of their Black history, including Lauren's friend Wilfred Myrick. We heard about someone being shot in a field because it was assumed that they were Lauren. We heard about Brunswick chief of police arresting every black person that came into town under the assumption that they were Lauren. So we got to hear quite a few stories, and it's really cool to hear stories outside of the Portland area, which gets so much attention, of course, because it's by far our biggest city. There's Black in Bangor, if you want to know more about the Black community in that area. So this is me doing my best to talk about Washington and Hancock counties, down East Maine, which is my area. So stay tuned, you guys, and we'll talk more about why the KKK chose Maine. I still have that episode that I did about the Wyndham Reformatory that I should totally publish before the season is up. So those will probably be our last 2 episodes for this season, the Wyndham Reformatory and the KKK in Maine. And yeah, so hit the like button, comment, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff. Join us over on Patreon, where I have attached files of primary sources, not all of them, of course, because I seriously have 200 articles on this guy in my collection. And then when we even start getting into other people, accomplices, and just small references to him and stuff like that, I have a lot. I really have a lot of files. So I pick some highlights. Some of my favorite sources, like the Bangor Daily News, tends to have really good reporting, so I use that one a lot. The Ellsworth American refers, because of course this is where he lived, so his hometown newspaper talks about him a little bit differently than other places where he's not as known as a person. There's a really funny reference where somebody got a copy of the newspaper and the ink was kind of light on it, and he had just escaped from the hospital, I believe, or the jail, and somebody wrote into the editor like, hey, did Robert steal your ink, or what happened there? And they were like, he's used up a lot of our ink, we still have plenty, it was just a weird thing. So you get some of those kind of references too. So yeah, hundreds of articles in my files for this. It's been really fun to do the research, put them together, try to come to an understanding of how to put the pieces together and tell a story out of this. The book, I'm really looking forward to the book, and I hope you guys are too. I hope you guys are looking forward to learning more about this, reading more about this, and will stick with me throughout the rest of the journey. So until we talk about this stuff again, you guys, I will be wishing you fair winds, following seas, and social justice, and some equity.